In the land of Israel, under the reign of King Ahab, the people had strayed far from the Lord. Idolatry swept across the land like a plague. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, he declared, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. And in their place stood shrines to Baal and the altars of the Lord had been torn down. At the heart of it was Jezebel, Ahab's queen, whose influence led the people deeper into rebellion. Alone in the wilderness, he found shelter by the stream. Each morning, as the sun rose red over the dry horizon, black-feathered ravens descended with food in their beaks. Her face was drawn, her hands brittle with wear. "Bring me a little water in a vessel, that I may drink," Elijah asked. As she turned to go, he added, "Bring me a morsel of bread in your hand, in the most unlikely form. Bread, meat, provision from heaven, as the Lord your God lives," she replied. "I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug." Perhaps it was faith. Perhaps it was hope. The woman obeyed. "Now I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, nor the jug of oil run dry." The Lord had spoken, and he had kept his word, that we may eat it and die. Each evening they returned again, as if heaven had trained its own messengers. "Do not fear. Go and do as you have said, but first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me." He was sustained, as was the widow and her son. But this was only the beginning. The drought in the land was not only of rain, but of righteousness. And soon the prophet would be called again, not to hide, but to stand boldly before a king and a nation that had forgotten their God. Afterward, make something for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty until the day the Lord sends rain upon the earth. Prophets of the Lord were hunted, silenced, or driven into hiding. And it was during this spiritual drought that Elijah, a Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead, was called by God to speak. Without fanfare or warning, Elijah approached King Ahab with words that cut like thunder. "Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. I have commanded a widow there to feed you." The king's court fell silent, but Elijah did not hesitate. He rose and walked toward the foreign land, guided by the word of the Lord. A drought in a land already dry. Elijah's words were not merely bold, they were dangerous. Ahab's heart was hard, and his queen but Elijah did not fear. He spoke not from pride, but obedience. At once, the Lord spoke to Elijah again. "Depart from here and turn eastward," God commanded, "and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan." And the land began to crack and groan. There, God promised he would provide water from the brook, and ravens would bring Elijah bread and meat morning and evening. So Elijah, but as days turned into weeks, the drought deepened. It was outside of Israel, Gentile territory, and home to Jezebel's people. The sky gave no rain. Even the brook that had sustained Elijah began to shrink, until one day the stream dried up completely. Still, Elijah waited. Then the voice of the Lord came again. Zarephath, at the gate of the city, he saw a woman gathering sticks. He was sustained, as was the widow and her son, but this was only the beginning. The drought in the land was not only of rain, but of righteousness. The woman paused and turned to him, sorrow on her face. But Elijah spoke again, calm and confident. Something in his voice pierced through her despair. And day after day, the jar of flour did not empty. Elijah remained in Zarephath for many days. He was sustained, as was the widow and her son. But this was only the beginning. The drought in the land was not only of rain, but of righteousness, and soon the prophet would be called again, not to hide, but to stand boldly before a king and a nation that had forgotten their God. Elijah had remained in the widow's house for many days. The small home in Zarephath had become a sanctuary, quiet, humble, and spared from the suffering that gripped the land, whose laughter had returned since the jar refused to empty and the hunger pangs ceased. Elijah watched the boy with a tenderness reserved for those who have lost too much and yet still believe. While others starved, the widow's flour and oil remained, replenished daily by a miracle that no hand could explain but the Lord's. It was a quiet mercy, unfolding one meal at a time. Then fever, then weakness. Elijah prayed quietly over him, speaking words of healing. The widow pressed cool cloths to the boy's forehead. Still, he grew worse. The warmth left his skin, the light dimmed from his eyes, and finally, his chest grew still. The prophet had grown close to the woman's son, a bright-eyed boy, no more than 10. But one morning, that laughter fell silent. He scooped the boy into his arms and descended the stairs. "What have you against me, O man of God? Now I know that you are a man of God." God had declared himself again, not just the God of provision, but the God of life, the God who sees, the God who answers when all hope is lost. She said, trembling, "And that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." He had seen God command ravens, but now death had entered the very room where God had shown his power. The Lord had more to reveal. He had watched the flour and oil multiply without end. The drought continued, and the people of Israel still bowed to idols. And Elijah's next journey would take him back into the lioness den, to face a king, a queen, and hundreds of false prophets who defied the living God. Alone with God, Elijah laid the child on the bed and cried out, his voice shaking with desperation. Why allow a miracle only to bring mourning? Have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I sojourn by killing her son? O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again. She cried, you have come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son. It began with a cough, just faint at first. The widow's cry pierced the silence. She turned to Elijah, anger and grief burning in her voice. Elijah stood in stunned silence. Give me your son, Elijah said softly. He carried the lifeless boy in his arms, ascending to the upper room where he stayed. O Lord my God, he pleaded. He stretched himself upon the child 3 times, praying each time with more urgency. The silence afterward was thick with grief and hope, and then the child stirred. Elijah felt it before he saw it. Breath returning, warmth flowing back into the boy's limbs. His eyes opened, dazed and blinking. A flood of praise leaped from Elijah's lips. See, he told the widow, his voice full of awe, your son lives. She looked at her child, then at the prophet. Her tears flowed anew, this time from wonder. In that house in Zarephath, surrounded by a land in ruin. But the story of Elijah was far from over. The drought continued, and the people of Israel still bowed to idols. The Lord had more to reveal, and Elijah's next journey would take him back into the lion's den to face a king, a queen, and hundreds of false prophets who defied the living God. 3 years had passed since Elijah first stood before King Ahab and declared that the skies would shut. 3 long years of cracked earth, parched fields, and empty skies. Livestock perished. Ahab had searched far and wide for Elijah. Jezebel, seething with rage, had sent men into every kingdom and nation to find him. Wherever Elijah might be, he was wanted, not for prophecy, but for punishment. Perhaps we may find grass and save the horses and mules, so we do not lose all the animals." So they divided the land between them. Ahab went one way, Obadiah the other. Crops turned to dust. "And as soon as I leave you, the Spirit of the Lord may carry you I know not where. And so when I come and tell Ahab and he cannot find you, he will kill me." Then, without another word, he turned and went to find Ahab. "Yet I, your servant, have feared the Lord from my youth." Dust swirled at Elijah's feet. The prophet stood alone on the rocky path, face turned to the heavens. The drought was nearly over, but the battle for Israel's soul was only just beginning. "Was it not told to you what I did when Jezebel killed the prophets of the Lord? How I hid 100 men in 2 caves and fed them with bread and water. And now you say, 'Go, tell your Lord Elijah is here. He will kill me.'" Rivers became beds of stone. "As the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, I will surely show myself to him today." Yet the people still clung to Baal, whispering prayers to a silent God. "Go, tell your Lord, behold, Elijah is here." Then the word of the Lord came again to Elijah. "Go, show yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth." The instruction was simple, but the danger was not. Still, Elijah rose from Zarephath and began the journey south, across the brittle land, toward Samaria where Ahab ruled. Along the way, he heard the whispers of suffering. Families displaced, children hungry, prophets slain, yet his steps did not slow. The Lord had spoken. Rain would come, but only when Elijah stood once more before the king. Meanwhile, King Ahab was not idle. In desperation, he called for Obadiah, the manager of his palace and a man of quiet faith. Though Obadiah served under the wicked king, he feared the Lord deeply. "What sin have I committed, that you would give your servant into the hand of Ahab to kill me? As the Lord your God lives, there is no nation or kingdom where my master has not sent to seek you." And when they said, "He is not here," he took an oath of the kingdom and nation that they had not found you. And now you say, "Go, tell your Lord Elijah is here." He lifted his eyes, and there stood Elijah. During Jezebel's bloody campaign against the prophets, Obadiah had hidden 100 men of God in caves, feeding them bread and water in secret. Ahab said to him, "Go through the land to all the springs of water and to all the valleys." As Obadiah walked the dry path alone, Obadiah froze in disbelief. "Is it you, my lord Elijah?" "It is I," Elijah answered. Obadiah stepped back. He looked around nervously. Elijah placed a steady hand on his shoulder. Obadiah stared at him for a moment, searching his eyes. The wind picked up. Dust swirled at Elijah's feet. The prophet stood alone on the rocky path, face turned to the heavens. The drought was nearly over, but the battle for Israel's soul was only just beginning. Ahab's chariot wheels ground against the dusty earth as he raced to the place Obadiah had spoken of. The king's face was hardened from 3 years of thirst and resentment. His kingdom was cracking, his people restless, and all he could see was the prophet he held responsible. Fury in every step, his eyes met the king's with steady resolve. "I have not troubled Israel," he answered, "but you have, you and your father's house. Now therefore, send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and the 450 prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table, sacred to both the Lord and Baal." Crowds murmured. People jostled for space. "How long will you go limping between 2 different opinions?" he cried. "If the Lord is God, follow him. Let 2 bulls be given to us, and let them choose 1 bull for themselves, and the God who answers by fire. He is God." Heads nodded. The stage was set. The lines were drawn. Israel would no longer limp between opinions. They would see, with their own eyes, who held the power to answer from heaven? Whispers of that sounds fair passed between villagers and elders. Even the prophets of Baal nodded, smirking with confidence. Cut it in pieces and lay it on the wood, but put no fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood and put no fire to it. But if Baal, then follow him, their garments colorful, their confidence high. And the prophets of Baal arrived in full array, yet trapped in spiritual darkness. 450 of them stood tall. Because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the bet. It was for the heart of a nation called to serve the living God. Is it you? Ahab snarled. You troubler of Israel? There, standing in plain sight, was Elijah. The king's robe flared behind him as he approached. Some looked to the ground, others glanced at the prophets of Baal, then back to Elijah. The silence was deafening. Elijah did not flinch. Perhaps the drought had broken something in his arrogance, or perhaps he hoped for a show of power from Baal in front of all Israel. Either way, messengers were sent. A challenge had been issued. Silence followed, thick as thunderclouds. He was not a fugitive, not a man hiding from fear. He was a prophet standing in the authority of the Lord. Elijah took a step forward. The boldness in Elijah's voice was unmistakable. Ahab, though still seething, made no argument. Soon, all of Israel was gathered on Mount Carmel, a rocky mountain overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. And there, alone on the other side, stood Elijah. He stepped forward and raised his voice to the crowd. No one answered. The people shifted uncomfortably. I, Elijah continued, even I only am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. He looked directly at the prophets of Baal. You call upon the name of your God, and I will call upon the name of the Lord. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Elijah folded his arms. The contest was not for Elijah's vindication, and now, under the open sky, the Lord would speak. The morning sun rose higher over Mount Carmel. As the people formed a wide circle around the makeshift altar, the prophets of Baal moved to the center of the clearing. Confident in their numbers, clad in ornate robes adorned with gold thread and symbols of their God, their leaders stepped forward, hand raised. Elijah stood at a distance, arms crossed, watching quietly. His face was unreadable, but his eyes never left the altar they were building, an intricate structure of wood, perfect for a grand display. But there was no fire. That was the test. You choose the bull, Elijah had said. Prepare it first, since you are many. His voice had held no sarcasm, only a strange calmness that unsettled them more than fury would have. Dust rose beneath their sandals. Sweat soaked through their garments. Farmers, elders, mothers with children, all eyes were fixed on the prophets. Surely, they thought, something would happen. Still, they cried out. Still, they danced. Baal was said to be the god of storm and fire. What better display of power than this? They prepared the bull with ceremony, chanting and waving their arms. They called on Baal in loud, rhythmic voices. The prophets collapsed, exhausted, bleeding, breathless. Even the skeptical now felt unease. All that noise, all that passion, all that devotion, and nothing, not a flicker, not a spark, not a whisper, no frenzy. Their cries turned into rasps, their movements slowed. "Oh, Baal, answer us!" they cried. In a horrifying display of devotion, they began to slash themselves with knives and swords, as was their custom. Blood flowed down their arms and legs, but they did not stop. They shouted louder, spinning and dancing around the altar. Some waved staffs, others raised their hands to the sky, but there was no voice. No one answered. No fire fell. The crowd leaned in. Hour after hour passed. Morning turned to midday. His gaze flicked to the crowd, many of whom now whispered and frowned. A few looked uncomfortable. A few looked afraid. "O Baal, answer us." They leaped around the altar, frenzied. Elijah watched, silent. Then Elijah stepped forward, arms open, and said loudly, "Cry louder! After all, he is a god, isn't he? Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling, or maybe he is asleep and must be awakened." A few people chuckled. The prophets did not. Their chanting grew more desperate. The sun beat down on them. Still, no fire. Midday passed into late afternoon. The crowd grew still. There was no voice, no answer. No one paid attention. And then, silence. Elijah stepped forward. His hands were steady, his robe simple. There was no shouting. The time for showmanship was over. The time for the Lord had come. As the sun began its descent over Mount Carmel, a quiet tension fell upon the crowd. The prophets of Baal lay slumped near their altar, their voices hoarse, their garments stained red. No fire had fallen. No God had answered. Elijah walked to the center, calm and focused. "Come near to me," he said. Stones lay scattered, half buried in dust. Elijah knelt and began to rebuild it. The people slowly gathered, some stepping over stones and brush, a nation still chosen, still loved, though lost in idolatry. With each stone, he restored more than just a physical altar. He cut the bull into pieces and laid it on the wood. He rebuilt memory. He rebuilt covenant, and poured it on the burnt offering and on the wood. He rebuilt faith. By the third pouring, the water had drenched everything and overflowed into the trench. The altar was soaked, impossible to light by any human means. Water was scarce, and yet Elijah asked them to waste it. Or so it seemed. The stones glowed and cracked. The water in the trench sizzled and vanished into steam. They obeyed. The water soaked the wood and meat, dripping down the sides. Drawing closer to the solitary prophet, he prayed, "Let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant." He simply watched as hearts turned and idols fell, "and that I have done all these things at your word." He raised no weapon. He uttered no chant. His voice was steady, reverent, almost gentle. He looked at the altar of the Lord, broken, neglected, and forgotten. Stone by stone, he set 12 in place, one for each tribe of Israel. Then he dug a trench around the altar, wide and deep. Next, he placed the wood in order, each log carefully set. Then he gave an instruction that caused murmurs in the crowd. "Fill 4 jars with water," he said. Servants fetched the jars. "Do it a second time," he said, "that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back." They did do it a third time. The crowd stirred in disbelief, and that was the point. Elijah stepped forward. "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," he paused, eyes lifted. "Answer me, O Lord, answer me." Silence fell. Not even the wind stirred. Then, in a single moment, heaven responded. A fire leapt down from the sky, fierce, brilliant, unstoppable. It consumed the offering in an instant. The wood turned to ash. It was not just fire, it was glory. The people cried out as one. Faces to the ground, hands trembling, voices lifted not in confusion, but in reverence. "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." On that mountain, under the fading sun, the living God answered. Not with noise or spectacle, but with fire that left no doubt. Elijah stood in silence. He didn't raise his arms. He didn't shout. But his work was not yet done. The sky above Mount Carmel was still dry, but the hearts of the people were breaking like storm clouds ready to pour. Faces lay pressed to the ground, trembling not from fear of Elijah. The Lord, He is God. They had witnessed the fire, now they would face the judgment. They cried again and again, the chant rolling like thunder through the mountainside. But from awe of the Lord, the crowd surged forward, emboldened, catching the false prophets before they could flee. They were taken to the brook Kishon, and there they were executed. The very ones who had led Israel into darkness, now removed in the wake of light. The Lord, He is God. Elijah stood firm, eyes never leaving the trembling prophets of Baal. Seize the prophets of Baal. Elijah called to the people. Let not one of them escape, who had watched everything from the edge of the assembly, stunned, silent, unsure of what remained of his authority. He cast himself to the ground, face between his knees, and began to pray. For there is the sound of the rushing of rain. No one hesitated. The prophets of Baal were gone. The Lord had answered by fire. He returned to his chariot and climbed the slope to feast, while Elijah climbed even higher, to the top of Carmel, alone, once more. When it was done, Elijah turned to King Ahab. Go up, Elijah told him. Eat and drink. Ahab, still speechless, obeyed. There, on the summit, Elijah knelt, not for fire this time, but for rain. Say to Ahab, prepare your chariot and go down, lest the rain stop you. The people hath turned. A gust of wind swept over the mountain, but the land was still thirsty. He said to his servant, go now, look toward the sea. The servant went and returned. There is nothing, as if heaven itself had been holding its breath for 3 years, and was now exhaling all at once. It drenched the earth, it soaked the stones, it filled the dry riverbeds. He gathered his cloak, tucked it into his belt, and ran, feet light, heart lifted. He ran ahead of the king's chariot all the way to the gates of Jezebel. His face remained to the ground, his prayers steady, his faith unmoved. Elisha said nothing, only nodded. Then he prayed again. Go again. A second time. Nothing. A third. Nothing. A fourth. Still nothing. 5 times. 6. Each time, Elijah did not rise. Then, on the 7th time, the servant's voice came with a tremble. Behold, a little cloud like a man's hand is rising from the sea. Elijah stood, his cloak lifting slightly in the shifting breeze. A cloud, small, distant, but real. Go, he said, urgency in his voice. The servant ran. Moments later, the sky, once clear and relentless, began to darken. Clouds gathered thick and fast. The sea rumbled in the distance. Then, rain. A hard, rushing rain. Down the mountain, Ahab rode furiously, racing his chariot toward Jezebel. But Elijah, he did not stay behind. The hand of the Lord was upon him. Not to seek reward, not to claim victory, but because when the Lord answers, his servants move, and the skies above Israel poured with mercy once again.